I'm Solomon Ayele Dersso. I'm the chairperson of the working group on extractive industries, environment and human rights violations in Africa of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. This is a long overdue conversation that needed to happen. Indeed, it's not a completely new thing, but it has become mainstream in the human rights discourse, which is a very hugely welcome development. There has been, discussions about human rights and the financial system separately. They were operating in silos. The result has been one where the financial systems have their own rules, institutional arrangements and setups that operate in a way that had no regard or very little regard to human rights. And the consequence of that is that today access to finance is not available to meet the Sustainable Development Goals set by the UN in the Addis Ababa agenda. And indeed, today we are also facing huge setbacks as a result of the intersection of multiple crises, including COVID, the rise of geopolitical tensions and wars and conflicts. And in this context, it has become apparent and imperative that the financial architecture that is now outdated has to be reformed if any prospect for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals is going to be achieved. If any prospect for meeting the minimum basic needs that human beings need in order to live a life of dignity is going to be realized in accordance with international human rights standards. So today, the fact that we are having this conversation is indicative that we can't operate with international systems without linking them with the needs of human beings. So there are certain very encouraging and promising proposals that are being put on the table. One of them, indeed led by the African Group in New York, has to do with the international tax system reform, which is critical in addressing some of the financial losses that particularly developing countries are experiencing, but it's not specific and unique to developing countries. It affects all of them, and this has to do with international illicit financial flows, which deprives countries and states of their source of revenue, and in depriving them source of revenue, it deprives them the requisite financial resources for investing in meeting Sustainable Development Goals, but also importantly in enhancing freedom, in enhancing dignity of life for people who are deprived of socioeconomic rights. In 2022, the African Group laid a process for the adoption of a resolution by the General Assembly, which requested the UN Secretary General to submit a report on how to go on the negotiation of a global tax convention on tax cooperation. The idea is basically that the current tax regime have created loopholes and gaps that have allowed multinational companies and big net worth individuals to escape and to evade their tax obligations, and that has led to a loss of $800 billion to the global economy. And the idea is basically on how to go about addressing this. And the report was submitted by the Secretary General in November 2023. The UN General Assembly adopted a resolution mandating the UN to lead the negotiation towards the adoption of this tax cooperation convention, which would set a minimum in terms of the tax responsibilities of corporations, but it would also ensure that there are standards that facilitate the capacities of countries in terms of expanding their tax base, but also effectively collecting and indeed getting what is due to them. As far as the reform of the international financial institutions are concerned, a lot needs to be done. For example, there is the immediate and pressing issue of debt distress that is affecting many countries and many economies, particularly in the global south. As the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights clearly indicated, these debt traps are changing into death traps. And therefore affecting the lives and livelihoods of people, particularly in developing countries. The reason for these debt distresses is structural. It has to do with, for example, the fact that countries in Africa have to pay 8 times higher interest rates in order to have access to finance than developed countries. There is a risk assessment that is outdated, that doesn't relate to the real risk of these countries. It is basically not also in accordance with human needs. It is modeled on the capital and the interest of capital. It's modeled on the business model of ever increasing expansion of profit rather than improving the well-being of people. So there is something that needs to be done in that respect immediately, whether it is in terms of ensuring that these countries who are in need of it have special drawing rights, for example, from the International Monetary Fund, rather than basically those with the higher, shareholding capacity who do not necessarily need these special drawing rights. It could be in terms of having concessional loans available to these countries, the restructuring of course, the debt, and that requires global cooperation, understandably. And finally, of course, addressing also the whole issue of risk assessment, the whole issue of the interest rate that is imposed on developing countries. This is one area that has to do with, of course, broader structural issues of the way power is organized and injected into the financial institutions. But the most important area that is so important and required is the shift that needs to happen from a human rights perspective, from a growth-based economic development model to a human development economic development model. That is so central, and that is what human rights standards require and need in order to ensure that we do not just have an international economic system that works only for profit and for capital, but we have a humane international financial architecture. The current model, economic development model, has brought us to the brink of existential crisis on account of, among others, the climate emergency that we are in. And that it can't get any clearer than that we have indeed to make substantial shift in terms of how we go about developing strategies for economic development. So the idea of giving priority, that is what the Sustainable Development Goal is premised on, which is increasing the standard of living of people. And that requires a certain way of mobilizing resources, a certain way of structuring and channeling those resources to areas that require the expansion of that standard of living. And with that expansion of standard of living and well-being to a larger percentage of people, particularly those who need it the most, then you would even create bigger pie than basically scrambling over a small pie. That's the current arrangement, which is skewed in favor of very little, tiny percentage of the people of the world. So basically the human rights economy, the right to development, becomes so crucial from that perspective. And we hope that this concerns literally everybody, all across the world, not just those from the developing world who are most affected. Certainly those from the developing world who are most affected feel it at, on a daily basis in their lives, would be the ones to champion and support this system. This is also about others, in having an international system that works for everybody is not just something, it's not about any, doing any favor to anybody. It is actually basically making this system one that we call all ours, that we can count on. And I think that is possible and can be done, but it requires the concerted effort of governments. Very important. Primary responsibility lies with them. The responsibility of indeed non-state actors, whether they are private actors, whether the NGO sector, the civil society actors, the media, individuals and professional associations, and personalities in the art world. They have to bring their voice to bear in order for us to mobilize a critical mass of people in order to achieve this shift, first and foremost in our minds, and then translating that into action in reforming the international financial architecture and the multilateral system as a whole, which is currently in very deep crisis. And we hope that the Summit of the Future provides us that opportunity in order to make this shift.